Tuesday marked the 14th anniversary of the super fight between challenger Ricky Hatton and champion Kostya, and I wanted to take a quick look back to celebrate that classic fight. As I say later in my breakdown, the junior welterweight division is a relatively young division, but despite that relative youth, it has hosted some amazing rivalries throughout the decades. Tszyu versus Hatton fits well within those classics. That fight had all the ingredients. A plucky, live underdog fighting before a gigantic hometown crowd, marching out to meet a long-reigning, dominant champion. In England, Hatton already had the popularity of a rock star, and Tszyu was sort of the quintessential fighter's fighter. There was even an interesting personality clash. Hatton was the loud but friendly everyman, while Tszyu was classy but extremely reserved, and the champion seemed to relish a certain outsider status. Hatton was even then known for his tendency to party and cut loose, while Tszyu was sort of like a modern Marcus Aurelius, known for his discipline and stoicism. But the most important thing of all was that it was a matchup between two gladiators who could fight like hell. 2005 was already shaping up to be a special year for the sweet science, and the showdown between Tszyu and Hatton was a big part of why that year went down as one to remember. As the classic English everyman, Hatton enjoyed rare popularity throughout his career. Before he was even a true contender, he routinely drew massive crowds to the MEN Arena in Manchester, which represented his primary base of operations. After winning against mostly soft touches during his first 20 fights, he began to amp up the level of competition. First, he KO'd a faded version of Freddie Pendleton before outpointing John Thaxton. He also got off the canvas to beat the dangerous Eamon McGee. 2 fights later, he was matched with Joe Hutchinson. This was the same Joe Hutchinson who had previously fought Arturo Gatti to a near standstill in their fight. In that fight, Hutchinson had sliced open Gatti's eyebrows and lasted the distance, giving Gatti a serious run for his money. By comparison, Hatton never let Hutchinson in the fight, swarming him with power punches before finishing the bout in the 4th round. That win over Hutchinson represented the beginning of a stretch of victories that really legitimized Hatton's status as a contender. In his next 2 bouts, he beat the former champion Vince Phillips by decision, and then stopped durable Argentine Aldo Rios. That streak was capped by a 3rd victory, a decision win over Ben Wonder Tacky. Each fight brought Hatton a step closer to the championship, and each win increased the enthusiasm of the crowds that gathered to cheer him on at the MEN Arena. The same English fans who had once cheered on a gallant loser in Henry Cooper had found a natural winner in Hatton. Hatton didn't necessarily look the part, with his pale, almost translucent skin and his short, stubby build. There was just something about Hatton that made people underestimate him. Maybe it had something to do with his affable, self-deprecating demeanor outside the ring. But those who underestimated Hatton suffered the consequences. The man continued to score victories after his impressive coming-out party against Tacky. After a 5th-round stoppage of Michael Stewart, Hatton was put in what was more or less a final eliminator fight for the World Championship. In that eliminator bout, he was matched with the exceptionally tough Ray Oliveira of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Although Oliveira was ostensibly the toughest test yet, the fight proved to be one of the most dominant wins of Hatton's career. Although the fight had been billed as a clash between 2 unstoppable pressure fighters, Hatton swarmed all over and outclassed Oliveira from the opening bell. He assailed Oliveira's ribs and ruptured both of his eardrums before becoming the first man to halt Oliveira inside the distance. When the fight was ultimately stopped in the 10th round, the stoppage felt several rounds overdue. The message was clear. The junior welterweight division had a new top contender. Although junior welterweight is one of the younger divisions in boxing, during its relatively short existence, it has hosted a high caliber of talent. Previous claimants to the junior welterweight throne have included Antonio Cervantes and Wilfredo Benitez, Julio Cesar Chavez and Pernell Whitaker, Barney Ross and Aaron Pryor. As Hatton methodically climbed the rungs of the rankings ladder, one of the scariest men in the history of the division was at the head of the pack. That man was Kostya Tszyu. Dubbed the Thunder from Down Under, Tszyu was basically a 140-pound killing machine, a man who had made the jumps from amateur star to professional prodigy to dominant champion with ease. Tszyu, a Russian expatriate living in New South Wales, Australia, was revered among the boxing press and fans alike. He was most notorious for his straight right hand, which had the range and power of a Soviet ICBM. But he wasn't just a head-hunting power puncher. Tszyu had a World Amateur Championship in 1991, and in the finals, he had seized the gold by soundly outpointing the excellent Vernon Forrest. Tszyu made great use of his left hand, sometimes using his jab in a probing fashion, gauging distance and testing reactions. And other times he fired that jab like a piston, punishing any opponent foolish enough to drop their hands. He was a fluid combination puncher who never forgot to invest in the body. To cap things off, he was guided by a boxing mastermind in the form of Johnny Lewis. Lewis was Australia's equivalent of American trainers like Emmanuel Stewart or Freddie Roach. He'd guided Jeff Harding to an improbable world title while steering Jeff Fenech all the way to the Boxing Hall of Fame. Along the way, he'd also worked with other world champions like Virgil Hill and Gary St. Clair. Tszyu turned pro in 1992, and he didn't delay his conquest of the world championship. He swiftly made his bones by beating the likes of Juan Laporte, Livingston Bramble, and Sammy Fuentes. He passed a major test when he managed to outpoint Olympic silver medalist Hector Lopez. He eventually went on to serve 2 separate tenures as junior welterweight champion. The first reign, which included wins over Roger Mayweather, Hugo Pineda, and Jan Bergman, was ended by Vince Phillips in the 1997 upset of the year. That shocking reversal was a critical moment for Tszyu, who learned the lesson from his lack of preparation in the lead-up to the bout. Determined to never lose another fight on the basis of preparation, Tszyu began to sequester himself in 12-week training camps, which were double the duration of a typical training camp. Living a Spartan existence, he was driven by a relentless perfectionism, committing himself to his craft as well as his conditioning. After the setback to Phillips, Tszyu rebounded by knocking out Kelvin Grove and Rafael Ruelas before annexing the WBC title from the brilliant Miguel Angel Gonzalez. That fight was a grisly spectacle. Tszyu tortured Gonzalez from start to finish. In the 10th round, Abel Sanchez rescued Gonzalez from any further punishment. That win marked the commencement of a dominant title reign, this one much longer than the first, as Tszyu rattled off a series of fine wins, typically inside the distance and always in dominant fashion. Leading up to the June 2005 defense against Hatton, there was speculation that Tszyu was slowing down. Now in his mid-30s, it appeared that he'd been bitten by the injury bug, perhaps in part because of his famously grueling training regimen. Because of assorted injuries, he'd been reduced to defending his title only once in 2002, once in 2003, and once more in 2004. That's typically an indicator that a man's body is beginning to betray him. But in the lead up to the fight, it was easy to ignore those warning signs. Though those years included only solitary title defenses, those defenses had been outstanding. First, he'd largely shut out the dangerous Ben Wonder Tacky. Then he'd ruptured the eardrum of poor James Leha en route to a TKO in round 6. And most recently, he'd perhaps outdone himself by blitzing longtime number 1 contender Sharmba Mitchell. Although it was Ricky Hatton who held the nickname the Hitman, when Tszyu made his ring walk at the MEN arena, most observers considered Tszyu to be the real assassin. After marching to the ring at 2 a.m., Ricky had a certain aura about him. It was strange, but it felt that even though he was a clear underdog, destiny had sort of chosen him for coronation that night. For his part, Tszyu felt like a supporting actor in the scale of the moment. As odd as it may seem, given his vast experience, but it seemed like the Aussie champ was a little taken aback by the occasion, with tens of thousands of Englishmen passionately baying for his blood. That slight hesitation on Tszyu's part was all Hatton needed. From the opening bell, Hatton used a carefully crafted game plan. He used his advantage in foot speed to dart in and out while sliding off at angles, swarming Tszyu in bursts. He also made liberal use of roughhouse tactics, wrapping Tszyu up in clinches every time the champion began to fire back. By cranking the pressure up as high as possible, Hatton effectively smothered Tszyu, taking away the power in his right hand, which was most effective when Tszyu could keep his target at range. Tszyu would retreat and try to plant his feet to fire off a counterattack. Although Hatton did have to eat some shots with this strategy, true to his plans, the champion was unable to muster anything really hard enough to score a knockout. And whenever Hatton did find himself in hot water, he would resort to roughhouse tactics to break the momentum. Clearly flustered early on, Tszyu finally began to regain some ground in rounds 5 and 6. He visibly bothered Hatton with a series of body shots, but when referee Mickey Van cautioned him about throwing low blows, Tszyu largely abandoned that successful body attack, and the fight fell back into the same pattern from before. As they made their way into the later rounds, both fighters must have been suffering from the grueling pace of such a physical fight, but it was Hatton who had the support of the hometown crowd. That crowd, which cheered everything from Hatton, lifted the challenger's spirits when it would have been easy to crumble from fatigue. During the championship rounds, it appeared that the fight was destined to go to the judges, but in the dying seconds between the 11th and 12th round, Tszyu rose from his stool early and capitulated. He'd had enough, and he surrendered his crown without any further fighting. Hatton, shockingly, was the new champion of the world, heir to a rich historical tradition. Stopping a champion of the caliber of Tszyu was a monumental feat, surely one of the greatest victories ever by a British fighter. Both the crowd and the new champion seemed to grasp the magnitude of the moment. Hatton was exceptionally gracious in his post-fight interview, thanking fans and congratulating Tszyu on an excellent title reign. That interview marked the end of a legendary night of fights and the beginning of an epic after-party in Manchester.